Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for being here. Today we're talking about mental health, particularly suicide and PTSD. My guest is Dr. Justin Baker, who is an expert in trauma and suicide prevention in the military and is a professor of psychiatry at The Ohio State University. Dr. Baker, thank you so much for being here. Great to see you today.
Thank you so much for having me, Lori.
So I wanted to start talking about something that was in the news aboard the aircraft carrier, the USS George Washington. We saw that there were 3 suicides in 1 week, and within a 2-year period, 3 or 4 others, so a total of 6 or 7. One is undetermined in nature, aboard one aircraft carrier. What are your overall takeaway thoughts about what's happening on the GW?
Yeah, so as you guys know, I mean, suicide is a leading cause of death for all civilians, including military members in the United States. So currently, it's the 10th leading cause of death. Roughly 46,000 people in 2020. So our data usually lags about 2 years. So in 2020, about 46,000 people died by suicide. And so it's not just a military problem. It's a problem that all of us face, and many of us in our lives have been touched by suicide, whether it was a loved one, a family member, a friend. What makes it difficult in the military is some of the highest rates in suicide are among younger men, which particularly is what the military is made of. So when we go to look at military rates of suicide in the military look extremely high because the military tends to have a lot of younger men. And so it's a complicated issue. Obviously, I'm former Navy, and so when anything like this reaches the news and I catch wind of it, of course, my heart and thoughts and prayers go out to the family members of those who died by suicide. It's a challenging and complex issue. There's not like a simple solution. It's hard. I think when tragic events like this occur, we want to be able to pinpoint what was the cause, because if we could find the reason or the cause, then we can avoid it in the future. And it gives us like a false sense of power and control over often something we don't have a lot of insight or power and control over. So I guess those are some of my initial thoughts on kind of what happened. I do know, so when I was I actually assisted on a different carrier, and while it was dry dock, so being worked on getting ready for deployment. And I know that that's a really challenging time for the crew. It's a time of a lot of long days, getting that ship prepared and ready to be seaworthy. And so I don't know if that was what was going on at the time, but I do know there's these benchmarks that have to be met in order to be seaworthy. And so typically there's long days. No one really likes being in dry dock. Sailors were meant to sail. And so when a carrier is kind of land bound, it's not as fun per se.
And, there were a lot of initial reactions. For example, some of the parents of the people who did commit suicide that said that they talked about having to work long shift, 12-hour shifts overnight and during the day. They couldn't sleep because it was so noisy, because there were so many repairs going on, and they had to park 45 minutes away. And so they really couldn't leave the ship very easily. So there was a real sense of isolation and sleep deprivation. So when you talk about the George Washington and then the military, but really even all civilians, just the greater public at large, how much do things like sleep deprivation and isolation play into it? Because you think about things like the isolation that so many of us have experienced recently with the COVID lockdowns, and just for the last 2 years being really kind of isolated, and we've seen suicide rates go up. So can you talk about isolation and in some cases sleep deprivation as it pertains to our mental health?
Yeah, I mean, sleep is huge to mental health. I often talk with my patients that if we can change 3 things, right, about how we live each day, and that is like what we eat, how much we sleep, and if we get exercise, that can actually solve a lot of our, not just mental health problems, but also a lot of physical problems. I know the Navy a few years back overhauled how they did shift work following those events I think it was the China Sea, where there was some collisions. Again, there was some discussion around how sleep might have played a factor in there. And so I know the Navy has taken strong efforts to adjust how they attend to sleep and made some good decisions along the way to help improve that. Another thing that you mentioned about the isolation, our team here has been piloting a peer-to-peer program, not with the Navy, but with the Air Force, and we've shown some pretty significant results with that. And we actually ran the trial during COVID. And so we had to get really creative, but we found that by implementing a peer-to-peer program for suicide prevention, so teaching kind of core peers strategies that we often teach in mental health, and getting those skills out into the workforce. Something like 50 to 75%, depends on the research you're looking at, of people who have died by suicide never made it into a mental health clinic to see someone like me, a psychologist. So if we're relying on only using mental health or the traditional outpatient clinics as the primary intervention, we're actually going to miss most of the people. And so by getting these interventions out into the workforce, we can create and foster that social connectedness to decrease that sense of isolation. We can essentially put the interventions where they can be implemented and used most readily.
I love the idea of peer-to-peer. That sort of sounds like equals. I happen to know that on the George Washington, one of the problems was normally there's sort of like a mentorship program where the older sailors sort of mentor and buddy up with the newbies, the fellas that come in, men and women who are new. And most of these suicides were among people who were very, very new to the military. But there was sort of a lack of older mentors available. So there was sort of a breakdown in the system there, but you're sort of talking about peer-to-peer. So talk about how important it is just for people to be involved in communities. So I'm thinking primarily of people who are parenting teenagers, to get them involved in teen sports, youth group at church, drama club at school, anything where there's a group activity and you're connecting with other people your age.
Yeah, we have some interesting data. It was done with the military, and I think it would apply to any social group or any connected group for teens or any adults really. But when the unit cohesion, right? So this idea of we're all in this together, we have a good working relationships. When that was high, when that was gelling and it was working really well, you could add actually a new member to that unit. And the effects of that overall unit cohesion would actually inoculate or protect that new member. So they would almost reap the benefits instantly. Now, on the flip side, right, if you have a unit that's not working well together, there's not that sense of togetherness, that's actually a risk factor for suicide. And so absolutely, right, so teens being isolated or alone, it can be potentially a risk factor. So the more connected they can be in sports or in drama club or through their local community or church, all of those things are going to go a long ways to protect or thwart that suicide risk.
But I'm hearing you saying, the one caveat is that the relationships have to be positive, and we hope that most of the time they are. When you talk about social interaction, talk about social media. Is this considered social interaction? Is this because we know so many people, children, teenagers, and adults, have sort of substituted those interpersonal relationships, the face-to-face relationships, with the online relationships?
Yeah, I think, again, I think we still need to do some more work in this area as far as investigating the effects of social media. But I think the content or the substance of the relationship is what's more important than the modality. So at least for our peer-to-peer program, we had to shift a lot of our interventions into that virtual space through Zoom calls or getting creative because social gatherings were not allowed. And that didn't seem to interfere at all. People made the leap, they transitioned over, but the substance and the content, the relationships were still very genuine and real. And I think that's the key. So I think regardless of modality, if it's a shallow or surface level relationship, whether it's on social media or in person, that's not going to have the same impact as if it was a meaningful relationship that's genuine, where people are, caring for each other and whatnot.
All right. Well, we're going to take a break and be right back with Dr. Justin Baker. Today, we're talking about suicide and PTSD. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're talking about mental health, particularly suicide and PTSD. My guest is Dr. Justin Baker, who is a professor of psychiatry at Ohio State University. And before the break, we were talking about suicide. Can you talk about what some of the warning signs, the red flags for suicide are, and when people hear or witness these red flags, what should they do?
Yeah, that's a really challenging question, Lori. And the difficulty with suicide is that sometimes we don't get the luxury of warning signs. And so there's been recent research that they've actually been able to estimate the time from when someone decides to make a suicide attempt and then they actually attempt can be as short as 5 or 10 minutes. And so that's not a lot of time for family or friends or loved ones to recognize signs. Now, certainly when you go look backwards, right, there's usually some type of maybe a relationship ending, like a breaking up with a boyfriend or girlfriend, or bad divorce, or maybe some legal difficulties or some work-related problems. But oftentimes in the moment, right, kind of like in front of the event, you don't see any like struggles, right? Now, sometimes you do, and there's can be depression or kind of withdrawal from social gatherings or community. There can be other signs and symptoms like increased alcohol use. But unfortunately, those can often happen in absence of suicide. So it's not a great prediction, right? And so recently, our work has moved away from, hey, what are the warning signs, to, hey, how can we make the environment for that individual safer? Say someone has been struggling, maybe having easy access to means, right? So methods of used to kill themselves, like weapons, or maybe like pills nearby. Maybe now's not a time to have easy access to those. So similarly, a good way to think about this, right, is like really the only time I need to wear a seatbelt in a car is when I'm in an accident. So other times, right, I actually don't need that seatbelt. In a lot of ways, it's actually really inconvenient and it can be kind of uncomfortable, limiting. And if I knew exactly when those accidents would happen, I would just buckle the seatbelt right before that. But because we don't know when those accidents happen, at least most of us, and that is, we have laws that support this, we always wear a seatbelt so that when the accident does happen, we are prepared. So similarly with suicide risk prevention, we're trying to move towards, hey, how do we lower the overall risk for everybody versus trying to pinpoint who's going to need that risk lowered in that moment. So making the environment safer, decreasing access to weapons, locking up guns, kind of storing them separate from their ammunition. These are things that actually have been shown to decrease suicide rates far greater than like pinpointing who's going to be the next person.
You're sort of collaborating some information I received from a neurosurgeon recently who treats gunshot wounds to the head, and said by far the biggest cause of gunshot wounds to the head might be surprising because it's not, very often reported on the news, but it's by far suicide. And he said that sort of what you were saying too, that people it's almost an impulsive decision to shoot yourself in the head. And if the access to guns was not so readily available, then that urge would pass. Like you were saying something like 5 minutes. He said to me 15 minutes, that when a person, but do you agree that if you decide you want to end your life, it will pass?
Yeah, so there's some classic research that they've done where they put like netting or like some type of barrier on a bridge where a lot of people would use to jump off for the intent to die by suicide. And even though there was another bridge that did not have those barriers within a walking distance, like less than a mile, people, maybe they started out towards that bridge to go, but they didn't make it all the way to the bridge, right? And so giving that enough time to pass, people figure out that, hey, I actually don't want to die. How we theorize suicide is that there's an emotion like regulation difficulty, right? The person is flooded with distressing feelings. And then there's a cognitive rigidity or inflexibility that occurs. Like, I can't think my way out of this problem. So I feel stuck and trapped and overwhelmed. And so people who are struggling with suicide, they want the pain of that distress to go away. They don't necessarily want to die. So if you buy a little bit of time, so again, I own guns. I'm not trying to infringe on anyone's Second Amendment rights. But if I am struggling, maybe I store my weapon in a lock safe where I have to find the key and then I have to go get the ammunition from somewhere else. That gives me enough time to think, hey, is this something I really want to do? Or is there another option I can use? Can I call a friend to talk with them about my concerns and my struggles right now? Can I reach out to a mental health provider? Can I just go for a walk? Sometimes just a walk is enough to clear their mind of the thoughts. So it buys that, 5-10 minutes of time in order to decrease the chances of the likelihood of dying.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating information. We're going to take another break and be right back with Dr. Justin Baker. Our topic today is suicide prevention and PTSD. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living. My guest is Dr. Justin Baker, who is a professor of psychiatry at The Ohio State University. We've been talking about suicide prevention, which of course we could talk about all day, but let's get to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We know that a lot of combat veterans suffer from this because of the trauma of war, but really there are a lot of civilians who suffer from this as well. Talk about some of the things that can trigger PTSD in regular life.
Yeah, so I think many of us maybe have kind of the stereotypical, PTSD is a veteran issue. But there is something like 23 actually common causes for trauma. So trauma can be any type of assault. It could be a natural disaster. It could be a result of loss of life of a loved one through like a cancer diagnosis or an illness. It can be in a car accident. There's lots of different things. So the key thing is there's a perceived threat or actual loss of life. That's kind of the criteria that's used to determine, hey, is this a potentially traumatic event? I think we get it gets a little dicey, right? Where we start calling almost everything traumatic. I think that's kind of infiltrated into our language. But really, when we're talking about clinical trauma, or a clinical diagnosis of PTSD, we're looking for that perceived threat or loss of life.
How can a person know whether they're actually suffering from PTSD?
So there's 4 main symptom clusters when we think about how do we decide if this person is struggling with with PTSD. So the first one is there's a reimagining or re-experiencing of the event. That can happen through intrusive thoughts during the day, or actually like through flashbacks where you actually think that the individual imagines that they're actually reliving the event. It can also take shape in the form of nightmares. The second cluster is around like hypervigilance or hyperarousal. There's like an uneasiness for the person, or like being on edge or on guard, alert all the time. Kind of that fight or flight system is easily activated for someone with PTSD. The third is the negative cognitions and moods. So what that looks like is like increased depression or sadness, lots of beliefs or guilt and shame, like I did something to cause this event, even when that's likely not true. And then the fourth kind of maintains the other 3. It's this idea of pervasive avoidance. So if I just don't think about the event, if I don't go around things that remind me about the event, all of this will kind of go away and resolve. And what we found actually, that's not typically the case, that avoidance kind of reinforces the first 3 symptoms and in some ways makes it worse.
Wow, that last part is really interesting. So what should a person do if they check a lot of those boxes that you mentioned? Is it possible to overcome PTSD?
Yeah, we have really good treatments for PTSD. And it's important to remind everyone that a lot of people will experience a traumatic event, but actually only about 20 to 30% of those who experience events go on to meet criteria for PTSD. So that means 70 to 80% go on to never develop PTSD. So I think we need to take stock that we are resilient people in general. Now, if you do go on to develop PTSD, we have really good treatments that target each of those 4 symptom clusters, particularly that avoidance piece, right? So coming in, meeting with a provider, in as little as 10 to 12 sessions, we can significantly reduce the impact that PTSD has in their life.
All right, this is wonderful information. We're going to take one final break and be right back with Dr. Justin Baker talking about PTSD. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're continuing our discussion with Dr. Justin Baker, a psychiatry professor at The Ohio State University. We were talking about PTSD, and it's encouraging that people can overcome this situation. And how do they, do they need to, where can they access information? And can people do it on their own, for example, by reading books? A lot of people don't like going to therapy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly how 70 to 80% of people go on to make a normal recovery following a traumatic event, is that accessing, talking with loved ones, family, friends, not isolating, not withdrawing following a traumatic event can all help to kind of prevent the development of PTSD. I think once someone is struggling and has, PTSD, I think at that point, like a self-help book or talking to a friend is likely not to be enough, that they need to probably get in with a professional at that time.
Well, we've been talking about suicide prevention and PTSD. Where can people, if people are listening to this conversation and saying, that sounds a lot like me, or it sounds a lot like my husband, or whatever, where can they get information and help?
We have a website set up. It's called Strive to Be. So strive and the number 2be.org. And you can go on there, and we offer treatments, especially if you're military or veterans. We also have some offerings for civilians to get access to PTSD and or suicide treatments. For veterans, their VA, their local VA is a great place to get care. There's actually lots of areas. Talking to your primary care provider for referrals to mental health providers. We actually have no lack of shortage of resources. The difficulty is getting people into those care programs and making the awareness known.
Get help. Yes, that's the big message. There's a lot of help out there. Just seek it.
There's a lot of help.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're all out of time. Dr. Justin Baker, thank you so much for being here. It was great to see you. We really appreciate the insight.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to you for joining us for this edition of Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye now.